relatively informal, so that if people want to interrupt, they should feel free to do that in the middle.
For my glasses,
Okay.
because I forgot them upstairs.
So the basically, I'm choosing two domains to compare and contrast today. Partly because they're two domains that I know are different in English and Spanish, so that's really all that you should take from the grouping these two things together, other than the fun etymological fact that they're related to each other, so I can use a parenthetical E to hit both of them. I want to look at how different languages conceptualize different semantic domains. I'm particularly interested in emotion, and I'm looking not just at English and Spanish, but lots of other languages. So I'm going to throw some data out from those things along the way. There's a really fundamental question that people ought to be even more worried about than they often are, which is basically how much do languages differ, especially conceptually. You know, we talk a lot as linguists about how languages differ grammatically or other things like that, but there's less of that outside of there are certainly a strong strand of that inside of cognitive linguistics, but I suppose I'm just sort of saying that cognitive linguistic turn is amazingly important. So the thing that's really interesting to me is that translation theory starts from the assumption that translatability is sort of deeply, deeply imperfect, and that languages don't really mean the same thing at all across different languages. And so they're always talking about optimizing for preserving the pieces of the meaning that you want to best preserve, and realizing which situation you're in. Whereas automatic machine translation assumes a noisy channel model, which has as its background assumption that basically Spanish is English spoken through a noisy channel. So it's kind of an interesting contrast, and I think that there are actually some fundamental problems for automatic machine translation that are lurking in here. But so so as I was saying, there is this fundamental problem that there's a disconnect between the people who do human translation and the people who do automatic translation. Sort of never got on the same page about this particular thing. And I think ultimately we'll see that there are some real issues. So I have a little bit of a distraction here with some data from Falam, which I call spicy because it's about emotions, and emotions are always fun that way. This is a language of Burma from the Kuki-Chin group of Tibeto-Burman languages. They're certainly not European languages at all, and they were recently converted to be Baptists, but other than that, they don't really have much relationship with European languages. They have a really wide range of expression patterns for emotion, as we will see. So mostly the things that they do with emotion are pretty familiar. And by the way, the orthography is the native orthography plus tones, basically, because they don't indicate tones in their orthography. So ji means fear, the verb or to be afraid. Du means to like. Nuam is to be fun, so on and so forth. You also have sort of things which are not very English-like, in that you have these suffixes like du, which is in fact related to the du, which you saw above, to like, which is sometimes called a desiderative and sometimes just translated as if it were a full verb. And so you can sort of see here that with something like those last two categories, the desiderative or oscillative categories, that if you call them desiderative and oscillative, then they look much more different from English, whereas if you call them, the particular Falam-specific way of saying dare or like or want, then they look more similar. So there, you can already see that using normal methods that translators would use, you sort of have a problem trying to decide how different is this from English. Nevertheless, there are some things which you can really tell are not the same. These things are called psychocollocations, and there's a big literature on them because they're really, really not like English. For example, "lunga oi" is what you say if you want to say you're excited or happy, but an important fact is that lung means heart in Falam. And it's not optional. You can't say, I am happy. There's no way to ascribe happiness to a whole individual. Happiness is something which pertains to the heart in Falam. And it's not that all of the emotions pertain to the heart. It is actually different emotions pertain to different body parts. So, tinahem is to be angry, and literally tin is the liver. And so anger is something that happens in the liver. And you can see that livers are also worried. Tinapan, sorry. And some of these words which are used in these phrases actually don't have any meaning outside of them, but because they have the normal possessive possessive prefixes, you can tell that they're nouns and so on. So in ningazak is to be ashamed, and ning doesn't have any other meaning inside the language, but if you want to actually use this, what you would say, if you wanted to say I'm ashamed, you would say kaningazak, and ga is the prefix that means my. So my ning is zak, to mean I'm ashamed. So at any rate, you can see pretty easily this is not too similar to anything we have in English. We have things like my heart rejoices, but we don't ever have these cases where it's obligatory to ascribe the feeling to particular body parts. And so it's pretty easy to see that this is something which is a different conceptualization of emotion than what we have in English. Especially the really specific sort of mapping from emotions to body parts, which can be arbitrarily complicated. So how do we judge this kind of data? I mean, the most obvious thing to say is that we can see from this that languages do differ semantically, right? I mean, that category that I just gave you of emotion words that work that way, there's nothing quite like that in English or in Spanish or any other European language. It's pretty common in Southeast Asia. There's lots of languages that work that way there, but languages are definitely different. So this is the sort of thing that originally gave rise to Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that there are deep differences between languages, and that this also gives rise to worldviews which are different as a result of these incommensurate semantics that different languages have. But there's a sort of a problem with that if you just want to label these semantics as completely incommensurate, because I was able to give labels to those things, even though, I have to caveat and say, well, if I say katina ham, that it doesn't exactly just mean I'm angry. It does have a different nuance of meaning to it, but still I can give a label to it. I can describe a situation that makes sense to an English speaker using an English speaker's kind of label. So intertranslatability does give you some kind of similarity. And there are different people more recently who have tried to negotiate this kind of boundary between languages are different and yet somehow they're the same. And I'm going to look at a couple of those approaches here. One of them is deeply cognitivist, Leonard Talmey's approach to lexicalization patterns and closed category items. And another approach which is called cognitive by some people and not called cognitive by other people, Anna Wierzbicka's natural semantic meta-language. But especially in the field of emotions, Anna Wierzbicka's work is really important. And actually, although I'm going to find problems with both of these approaches for various reasons, both of them are really valuable and have a lot of stuff that's right and will need to be captured in any theory that could hope to talk about how languages are different semantically. So just because I rather suspect that people don't know that much about the Wierzbickian approach, I'm going to give you a little bit of a description. So the idea is that all meanings are expressible as explanations, which are composed from this really small, limited vocabulary, which is supposedly universal. So here I give you a little tiny fragment of the description of anger. So this leaves out the part where I feel something bad. So anger is a bad feeling. And it's a bad feeling that happens when this person that I feel something bad towards did something bad. I don't want this person to do this, whatever it is. And I want to do something to this person because of this. So you can see that this is very, very limited vocabulary. And it's actually kind of hard to understand as a result of that. And I think there's a deeper message there, but we'll worry about that later, and certainly feel free to ask questions about that later. But the thing that's really clearly right about this is that it is useful to think of meaning as composed. And that using an explanation based on limited natural language lets you do that. It lets you compose pieces and put them together in the same kind of way that language actually puts things together. This isn't quite the way that natural language normally puts things together, but nevertheless. And one thing that's really clear is that describing emotions in terms of what they are a response to is really a plenty good idea. And that's an approach that's been used by a lot of people, especially after Wierzbickia's work, although that idea did not originate with Wierzbickia. She picked it up and it became sort of the dominant theme. There are also some languages put a little bit more emphasis on what kinds of actions are expected afterwards, and there's reference to that here. I want to do something to this person because of this. So that is certainly true that anger is about somebody doing something and then you think that something should happen to them or that you should do something to them as a result of that. That's the background for understanding what anger is. But there are problems. So the problem is that although she talks about the syntactic composition, for one thing, she doesn't actually give a formal model in any way, and in fact says that a formal model is not possible for talking about how even these simple words combine, which is annoying at best, wrong at worst. And even if you sort of hand wave about her definitions, there isn't any way to compose these explanations that she gives with other explanations in order to get a meaning of a whole English sentence that has real English words in it. Because these compositions are not entirely straightforward. So for example, feel angry is given a completely separate definition from be angry, which is right in the sense that there is a different semantics to feel angry and be angry. But that relationship is exactly the same as the relationship between feel sad and be sad. It's not really different. But if all you're doing is composing words, you can't actually pull out what is similar across those, the cross-cutting similarities there don't come out in a neatly circumscribed piece of natural semantic metalanguage. And so it just doesn't work for that. So that's sort of the criticism from within the assumptions of the theory. So even if you grant all the assumptions, this still just doesn't work. This is a dumb way to do stuff. And the trouble is even further that there's plenty of evidence that these universals are neither complete nor universal. So even if you did like the approach for some reason, I can point you to lots of stuff that shows that this is wrong. So, okay, we got a good idea. We need some compositionality even inside of our descriptions of meaning, but the rest of this stuff is probably not something that we need to keep in whatever final theory we have. So the Thomaian approach studies semantic differences in lexicalization across languages, and it assumes schemata with different parametric diatheses. So, for example, you have a distinction between a causative expression for some scene versus an encodative expression for some scene versus a stative expression of some scene. And that describes such groups as teach versus learn versus know. And that's a perfectly good way to describe the differences between that particular set of words. They have a similar background. They're all talking about, knowing things and various stages of knowing things and things like that. Another example is multiplex versus duplex versus uniplex. This is a good example of crazy Thomaian terminology which proliferates. But you can sort of see what this is talking about. There's a distinction between among versus between versus near, where among requires that you have at least 3 things that you're locating with respect to, between requires that you have 2 things you're locating with respect to, and near just requires that there's 1 thing you're locating with respect to. So pretty straightforward and really powerful for talking about things, especially since he does not circumscribe at the outset what all of these diatheses are. And in fact, it's really important that he says, we need as many diatheses as we find, let's go out and find them. And so that's certainly an important part, that not circumscribing your space of description at the outset is a really good idea. So here I'm going to finally get to some Spanish. Here you have an English and Spanish sentences which are paired. These are actually from an Agatha Christie novel, in case you care to look up the context. Entró en la biblioteca como de costumbre. In English, she went into the library as usual. There's really nothing remarkable about this translation. This seems like, if you have an English sentence, she went into the library as usual, this is a perfectly reasonable way to translate this into Spanish. And in fact, it might be a little bit hard right here to see that there actually is a conceptualization difference. We'll get to that in a second. In the field of emotions, I'll give you one little example. Soy cosmopolita, pero me sorprendo como los de pueblo. In English, I had a little trouble, I translated this one, but I had a little trouble translating it completely fluently, but I think this is okay. I may be cosmopolitan, but I'm as surprised as a country bumpkin. This is actually from El País. This was from an interview with this great film artist, and so this was actually the title of this interview, was this Spanish sentence, which I thought was really quite something. How do these things differ from each other? I mean, these seem like really pretty straightforward translations. I don't think there's no magic here. This doesn't seem fancy. But one thing to notice is that in the case of entró en, this is describing a punctual state change. And you can also notice that the path is encoded inside the verb. So the verb encodes the event, and it also encodes the path. In English, if you're a Spanish speaker, you might not even realize this. I've certainly asked Spanish speakers and had them have their minds blown when I tell them this. But to go into is not actually a punctual event. The into part is punctual, but the going part isn't. And so the going is actually a durative event, and it culminates in entering, right? So this is actually, if you'd been here for Nancy's talk, you would know that this is, the achievement Vendler category. And you can also see that the path is not encoded inside the verb, but is actually encoded in what Ptolemy is called a satellite, which basically means something which is not the main predicate of the sentence. So you can see these are pretty small differences, but they're there. And then in the case of the Spanish sentence involving emotion, one thing that's very striking to an English speaker is, and this was on the other side, my mind being blown when I found out what Spanish was doing. So, me sorprendo is actually a state change. So it's where you change from sort of not being surprised to being surprised, and it's punctual and all this stuff. In English, there's not really any way to say that. Not even really compositionally. So to become surprised is really awkward and sounds bad. So we don't, like that would be the natural translation. You'd think you would say to become surprised or get surprised or something like that. But those are all amazingly rare. If you look in corpora, you don't find English speakers actually saying that kind of stuff. Instead, what we use is we just reconceptualize it as a state. So we say, I am surprised. Surprised is just a state. We act as if it has a duration and all that sort of stuff. And we know it's a temporary state. I mean, surprise is fundamentally and inherently temporary, but still, we conceive of it as a state. Which is why we can use the verb to be paired with it. So we saw that there was a difference in the emotion word, sorprenderse. And so we can definitely see that there's a difference in the languages, and it's an obligatory difference in that you can't actually express the Spanish concept exactly as we express it in English. It's not actually available. But if you use, this is implicitly sort of arguing about Ptolemean approach here. One of the things that Ptolemy is very fond of doing is looking at the differences in roots. So in the smallest meanings of the language. The difference in emotions is largely not a difference in the roots. So English has lots of causative emotional predicates, as does Spanish. And it just happens to be that in English, almost all causative emotional predicates are less common than their stativized counterparts. So anger, the verb, is pretty rare. Angry, the adjective, is really common in comparison. These are counts, by the way, from the British National Corpus. I should have said that. But and interest, the verb, is not that common. But interested, the adjective, is more than 10 times as common. Even though, I mean, this is a little bit counterintuitive in that it seems like interested is built from the verb interest. But nevertheless, interested is the basic member of the pair. We really like to think of emotions as states. Bore versus bored, similar. Pleased versus pleased is a little bit more even. It's the verb is almost as common as the adjective. And then you can see that actually there are a few cases that go the other way. So in English, to annoy is actually more common than annoyed, at least in the British National Corpus, and this seems to be right. I cross-referenced it with Google and some other things like that. Plus it fits my intuition if that was worth anything, which it usually isn't. So it's interesting that it works out this way, and we could talk about why this exact pattern is the way it is, but that wasn't what I was going to focus on here. The thing to notice is that when you compare to Spanish, so these are counts from Google, and so they have to be taken with a grain of salt, but I had some trouble with net connections to Spanish corpora and getting things to work last night, so I used Google instead. Sorprende, that's just that word by itself, not all the forms, but just the third person singular, occurs 4.6 million times in comparison to sorprendido, which occurs 2.8 million times. And this is really quite different from English. So note that the surprise in English as a verb occurs 1,100 times, but surprised occurs about 4 times as much. So, there's really a difference in terms of how commonly we do these different patterns. And what you really want to note is that this is not a difference in the roots, right? This is a difference in how you build the full word. It's a little bit difficult in the Ptolemean approach to distinguish between those things, and he actually sometimes is talking about full words and sometimes is talking about minimal roots. So this is just sort of pointing out we need to be more careful about that. Anyway, you can see that the pattern is similar for other Spanish verbs versus past participles or stated participles formed from them, that in general the verbs are more common than the participles. Yeah, and some of them are amazingly different. So gusta versus gustado, but that has to do with gustado being special in a huge number of ways anyway. And gustado was largely actually part of he gustado or something like that. No, or sorry, ha gustado, me ha gustado, and things like that. So it's not even the adjective form actually. So at any rate, there are some special things going on here, but you can see that this is quite different from the picture in English. So just to abstract away what's going on and why things are different, one of the differences that is a constructional difference. That Spanish has a reflexive construction which is often used to form an encodative state change verb from a causative verb. So you can say something like enfadar, to anger, as a causative verb, but you can also use the verb enfadarse to get angry. And so as a result, you sort of, in comparison to English, you have two different duties for these verbs, and so that obviously gives them a bit of a boost in terms of how they're actually used in language. But even more than that, if you look at the encodative use versus the causative use, it turns out that for most of these verbs, the encodative use is actually more common than the causative. So if you look in a corpus, and I don't have the numbers here because I had to look at such small subsets that I don't have representative samples. I would have to really do a complete annotation for these guys, and there were too many for me to do that. But basically the split is something like 60-40 for many of these verbs. And you can see that this is sort of part of a broader pattern, that Spanish prefers a state change conceptualization at the lexical level in both motion and emotion. And in the case of the motion verbs that we saw before with entrar, that's at the morphemic level, you know, entrar is minimal. But in the case of something like enfadarse or sorprenderse, that's at the lexical level after you have built these encodative verbs out of causatives. So we can see that there are multiple levels at play, but some of the same things are happening at the different levels. So it seems that Spanish really just wants to build words which are state change more often, and whichever way you do that, whether you started out with a verb which was fundamentally about a state change, or you had to build a verb that was a state change, either way works. Whereas English prefers a stated conceptualization of emotions at the lexical level. So as I pointed out before, there are lots and lots of causative verbs in English, but we tend to use them as states. We tend to turn them into states at the lexical level. And as far as motion is concerned, this is a well-known phenomenon, which we could say a lot more. English has a pattern in which a durative motion event is combined with a locative relation substage. So for example, he climbed into his own room, which might be difficult to say exactly that way in Spanish. Whereas in English, this is really, really, really normal kind of sentence. Okay. So here we had to introduce a whole bunch more data in order to get here because the Ptolemean approach is pretty good, but there are some problems. So in the Thomian approach, words are seen as bundles of independent semantic features. He never explicitly says that they're independent, but he doesn't ever do anything cross-cutting about them. So let's just say that it's an argument from silence. There is certainly no abstract bundling of features. So if you look at a Thomian analysis of anything, he talks about words having a whole bunch of features like causative and multiplex and all of these things, but he doesn't talk about abstract categories which are causative multiplex categories or anything like that. And because of that, there's nowhere to actually describe the co-occurrence of features except at the lexical level. And that's not right because, as we saw, these are patterns that extend across large numbers of different words in Spanish and English. These are not patterns which are individual, these go across the language. But the only way that you can describe them is conjunctively. So you say, well, if you have an emotion, then together with the emotion, you prefer to conceive it as a state in English. Right? So you have to conjoin those two things in order to actually get the right description. And there's not really any way to talk about that in Thomian terms. So here we have the idea that we really should have bundling, and it turns out that that's exactly what frames do. So here, no surprise, I've been working on FrameNet for years and years. I tend to think that it's the answer to most of your lexical semantics questions, if not all of them. But in this particular case, it's a really obvious fit for fixing our problem. So these exact bundlings that I'm referring to, where you bundle together different features of semantics, we call frames. And these features, along with their partially specified constraints and the elements of the scene, form a gestalt. And that's basically what frame semantics is all about. So we just, for terminological reasons, you should know that the pieces of the scene are called frame elements. And it's kind of important that if you pair this with a construction grammar theory, which hypothesizes that every level of language is a pairing of form and meaning, then you can say that these meanings are in fact exactly describable by frames, these bundlings of features. And in fact, that's a really good description for the meanings of everything that we've looked at so far, and we can talk about whether there might be anything beyond frame theory, but as far as we know, this approach works pretty well. So let me give you an example in a little bit more detail, just because it's a little bit hard to see what a frame would be without one. So here's the motion frame, and the first thing is just a definition. A theme begins at a source, travels along or past a path, and ends up at a goal. The direction, area, distance, and speed of the theme may also be specified. So this is a pretty typical kind of frame-nutty definition. And you can see that everything is interdefined in this example, right? So the theme, being the thing which moves, is defined by its relationship to starting out at a particular location and ending up at some other location. And those locations themselves, in terms of being goals and sources and paths, are defined by their relationship to the theme. So everything points to everything else, which is classic Gestalt kind of description. So these frames, among other things, among constructions of other sorts, are evoked by words, such as English go, Spanish ir, Japanese iku, and lots of other things. So those would all evoke the motion frame in particular. And it's important to note that because we want to talk about how the different pieces of the meaning relate to each other, we also have relationships between the frames. So that things like departing, what we call traversing, and arriving are all pieces of the motion scene. They're sub-stages of the motion scene. And it's also important to note that the subtyping is fully specified as well. We have a good model of that. So that, for example, self-motion, which describes things like walk or run, where things are self-propelled, is a subtype of the more general motion class. It's kind of obvious. Motion directional, things like fall, a different subtype with a different kind of extra specification. A couple other frame relations which are important. The using relation declares that one frame presupposes another, and that frame is bound as a whole to some frame element. So for example, motion uses the locative relation frame, which is for things like in and between and all those other kinds of positional descriptions, for each of the source, path, and goal elements. So source presupposes a locative relation, path presupposes a locative relation, and goal does. It's pretty straightforward. So this is really important when it comes to comparing to natural semantic metalanguage, because as we saw, the thing that we really wanted to keep from natural semantic metalanguage was the compositionality. We wanted to be able to keep the fact that we could build up semantic objects and put them together and have them form larger objects which were formed out of those smaller semantic pieces. So essentially in the frame theory, textual composition of primitives is replaced by the frame-to-frame element relations. So in the description of anger that we had before, we had this person does something bad, I feel something bad because of this. That description in FrameNet terms is you make an anger frame, and that anger frame has a using relationship with the frames representing this, which is the misdeed frame. So the anger frame uses the misdeed frame, and misdeed is bound to the stimulus frame element, which is inherited from a more general emotion frame. So you have a general emotion frame which has a stimulus and has somebody who feels the emotion and has possible responses and all those sorts of things all bound up in our general idea about what emotions are about. And then you have a more specific case of anger where there is some misdeed and you're responding to that. You feel some emotion because of somebody's misdeed. Okay? So you don't really need natural semantic metalanguage if you have this kind of compositionality. We can also notice that there's a particular type of relational structure which occurs across the entire set of frames that describe a language. And this isn't English specific or Spanish specific. This seems to be true for the frame descriptions of any language, that frames normally, most frames will inherit from some more general abstract prototype. And they are at the same time a point of view on some rich scene that has a bunch of different possible conceptualizations of it. One of the things that interacts with this is metaphor theory, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but at the more straightforward lexical level, you have buy and sell belonging to buying and selling frames, which are perspectives on one piece of a commercial transaction scene. And commercial transactions have a really complicated set of things that happen. You know, you have the people having different things at the beginning than they do at the end, and there's all these things about layaway or change that is given back, or terribly complicated stuff that happens in a commercial scene. All of that is the same between buy and sell. Buy and sell don't have to say anything extra. You have a commercial transaction frame that describes how all of those things interrelate to each other. But you do need to talk about how buy and sell are different from each other. In particular, buying inherits from getting. It's a kind of getting which happens within this scene where goods and money are being exchanged. And selling inherits from giving. It's also important to note that buying inherits from getting, and the goods of the commercial transaction is bound in that relationship to the thing which the person gets, which is called the theme. And selling inherits from giving, in which the goods in that particular relation is bound to the gift of the giving scene. So with all of this kind of specification, you can see that this is the way that normal words work, actually. And we can see that because there are these repeated high-level frames that occur over and over and over again, that it's actually pretty easy to see that things like event, transitive action, intentional act, and something as broad as projector landmark, which just locates two entities relative to each other, or has one entity make reference to some other entity very broadly. It explains why certain Ptolemean features are really broadly useful in talking about the vocabulary of the world's languages, because there are these high-level frames, they seem to be shared across all languages as far as we can tell. Those very basic conceptualization patterns are universally available, and they get lexicalized in different languages in different ways. And because of that, talking about the particular subtypes of these high-level frames, or the particular different types of conceptualization of these scenes, is a really productive way to talk about how scene descriptions differ across languages. So one thing that we can notice is that our Phalam data is explicable with frames, and so we can be really precise about how things are the same and things are different. So in particular, with each of the emotion frames, you can see that they fit this same pattern that I was talking about before, where there's a rich scene, and then there are different perspectives on that scene. So that there's a scene of fear in which you have somebody who feels something, and they feel something because they think that perhaps there's a possibility that something bad will happen to them. So it's basically, it's an emotion which is generated by an expectation of bad things. And so you can have an example like D, which conceives of that situation as just a state. So that's the perspective on that scene, which thinks of that situation as just being static. And so that really tells us that, with both of these kind of dimensions of description, that this is a really good match for something like be afraid in English, because that's a very basic way in English to conceive of that scene in terms of a state. And similarly, you can describe some of these other scenes in the same way. You can also notice that even if these were not identical to the English descriptions, we can at least use the frame elements of the very broad emotion frame, which include things like the experiencer and stimulus, to talk about how these descriptions are similar to the English description. So even if, and I can tell you, for example, that wum is actually not the same as English be fun. There's all sorts of persnickety differences. It's different, but at a higher level of description, it is a response that somebody has when they are currently involved in some situation that they like. So the difference is that in English, be fun, I think, requires that it be an activity, whereas wum actually doesn't really require that in the same way. So you can say this if somebody got a promotion, then in English you would say you're happy for them, but you wouldn't use I for other reasons, which is the other version of be happy in Phalam. for other reasons. So, some of the other familiar patterns work out as well. So we can notice that vui is not actually quite like anything in English, because we don't have a verb to make somebody regret something. We can put that together with words, and we can make plus regret. But in Falam, this is a basic concept. And actually, the normal way of talking about regret is this. So that if you want to say, I regretted that, you would probably say, I was made to regret that. Because that's their basic conceptualization. But notice that even though we don't actually have that basic lexicalization, we can still relate it to the English description pretty easily, because we can talk about a regret scene in terms of some emotion that you feel as a result of something that you did that wasn't as good as you thought it should be. That's regret in a nutshell, and that's also a perfectly good description of vui and the scene which pertains to that. The only difference is that we have to inherit from a different frame to talk about the difference. You can also note that just another aspect which is a little bit different from English, that you have some of these causatives are actually derived. So ti is to scare versus di, which is be scared. And their only difference is this little h that you add in there, and that's something that happens sometimes in Falam, but it's not actually productive. So we can also see that the unfamiliar patterns are also perfectly well describable using frame semantics. So whether we wanted to call a desiderative suffix or we wanted to translate it as like, that doesn't matter as long as we understand which frame it makes reference to. So this is a way of getting around like the fact that you can label something to make it look really different, or you can label something to make it look really normal. And that was one of the really fundamental problems with the Sapir-Whorf description of languages, that made languages seem even more exotic by carefully choosing translations that made them look really weird. But if you give a framal description, you can be very precise about exactly how different or the same these things are. And so, I think on this basis you would certainly translate Falam using like and dare for these particular examples, because they refer to exactly the same frames as the English counterparts. The only difference is that you have to be careful when you describe the constructions that these things pertain to. The ways of putting these words together with other words is special. So they don't use the same method of putting, the same method of composition as some other words, but we can be precise about that as well. We talked about the profile experiencer. Okay, so I'm coming to the end here, but there is a really important question that I haven't really been talking about. Lurking in the background, and more than in the background in the Sapir-Whorf debate from long ago, is the question of, is this just a difference in language, or is this really a difference in how people think, in some important sense? And it's clear that lexical and constructional differences give rise to language-specific semantics. So, and we can be quite specific about how that is. And so, do speakers of different languages think differently? Well, there's sort of a weak version of that, which is certainly different speakers of different languages have different structures that they normally access just in order to speak. And so, as a result, at the very least you expect there to be differences in how people think when they are speaking, or when they are planning to speak, or something like that. And that's been robustly shown in a lot of different ways. But there are also some differences in non-linguistic tasks which are attributable to these linguistic differences. And this isn't my research, but I'm just sort of pointing at this as one reason why we really need to worry about these differences in conceptualizations across languages, because some research, such as that done by Gentner and Meyen Boroditsky, show that different metaphors for duration will actually change the kinds of errors that people make in time estimation tasks. So in English, time and length are entangled because we talk about things taking a long time, where we use the adjective long, which is shared with length descriptions. Whereas in a language like Spanish, you say mucho tiempo, much more normally and often. And as a result, there's an entanglement between length and quantity. And this has robust effects even when tested in non-linguistic fashion. So this shows that this isn't all just sort of the domain of the linguist. It shows that stuff that we find as linguists might actually be relevant for testing for non-linguistic tasks that have differences that are based on what somebody's language is. Here we have the process frame, the finished subframe following the ongoing event. This frame is inherited by public lecture. Therefore, this lecture does have an end, and as is usual, the lecture ends with thanks to all of you for listening.